This video takes us to Nigeria, a country in West Africa, predominantly divided into the northern and southern regions. In the northern region, a 13-year-old child lost her innocence and her will to live. What pleasure can an adult male derive from getting married to a child who's barely 13 years old? A 13-year-old should be in the four walls of a school, studying to have a better future. But this was not the case of Hawa. 13-year-old Hawa was married to a man old enough to be her father, but weeks later, this singular union would result in the loss of 4 lives. This true crime documentary will unveil the darkest parts of traditions and beliefs you never believed existed. Welcome to Forbidden Passion. I am glad to have you join us on another video. Kindly subscribe, like, and share. Let me know where you're watching from. Hawa Abubakar was born in the quiet, sun-baked village of Garindole, nestled in the remote plains of northern Nigeria. Her family lived in a modest clay house with a thatched roof, surrounded by dry farmland that struggled to yield enough for their daily sustenance. The youngest of 5 siblings, Hawa grew up in the shadow of her elder brothers, who were seen as the pillars of the family's future. Her birth brought joy to her mother, Amina, but to her father, Malam Musa Abubakar, she was simply another hand to help with the relentless grind of rural life. Hawa's father was a stern man, deeply entrenched in the traditions of their community. He believed in the strict separation of roles based on gender and age. For Malam Musa, boys were to work the fields and carry on the family name, while girls were to learn the art of homemaking until they could be married off in exchange for dowries. His beliefs were shaped by the generations before him, where survival meant adhering to these societal norms. Her mother, Amina, was a quiet but gentle soul who doted on Hawa in the rare moments they could share away from Malam Musa's watchful eye. Amina's days were consumed with endless chores: cooking, cleaning, fetching water from a well miles away, and managing the livestock. Her face, weathered by years under the harsh sun, often carried a faint smile when she spoke to Hawa, though her eyes betrayed the sorrow of a woman who had long since resigned herself to her fate. Hawa's early years were defined by labor and longing. From a young age, she accompanied her mother to fetch water, carrying small clay pots that grew heavier as she aged. Her tiny hands were skilled in weaving mats and husking grains, tasks she performed tirelessly. Though she often worked alongside her siblings, the boys were given more freedom, allowed to attend Quranic school in the mornings and play in the evenings. Hawa watched enviously as they laughed and ran under the open sky, their days filled with possibility, while hers seemed to stretch endlessly into monotony. The closest glimpse Hawa ever got of education was when the village children gathered at the local madrasa. She would linger near the edge of the school, listening to the rhythmic chants of Arabic verses. Her heart ached with curiosity and a yearning to learn, but Malam Musa dismissed such desires as foolish. "A girl does not need education to keep a home," he would say gruffly, silencing any plea she or her mother dared to make. Despite her circumstances, Hawa nurtured a quiet hope. She often imagined herself holding a book, reading stories of faraway lands. On rare occasions, when Amina was feeling brave, she would whisper tales of women who had overcome hardships, planting seeds of courage in Hawa's young heart. Yet, as she grew older, the weight of tradition bore down more heavily. By the age of 10, Hawa was fully immersed in the duties of a homemaker, from preparing meals to tending to the goats. Her childhood, though not without moments of joy, was fleeting. Her laughter grew quieter, her dreams dimmer. In the village of Garindole, the rhythm of life was dictated by necessity and tradition. For Hawa Abubakar, the monotony of her days often gave way to fleeting moments of wonder as she watched other children her age march toward the village madrasa. These children, with their slates in hand, would spend their mornings reciting Quranic verses and learning to write in Arabic. The sight of them passing by her family's compound stirred a deep longing within her, a yearning to escape her life of unending chores and immerse herself in the world of learning. Hawa's fascination with education began one fateful afternoon when she accompanied her mother to the market. Amid the bustle of traders and the cacophony of bartering voices, her attention was drawn to a young boy, no older than 12, sitting beneath a tree with a book in his hands. His face lit up as he read aloud, his words spilling forth like a song. Hawa stood transfixed, her heart pounding with a mixture of awe and envy. That boy had something she desperately wanted: the ability to read, to explore the world beyond the confines of their village. When they returned home, Hawa timidly broached the subject with her mother. "Mama, why can't I go to school like the others?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Amina hesitated, glancing around to ensure Malam Musa wasn't within earshot. "My daughter," she began gently, "your place is here, learning the skills that will make you a good wife and mother. Your father believes education is for boys." Hawa wasn't satisfied with this answer. That night, she sat outside under the vast expanse of stars, imagining herself as someone important, a teacher, perhaps, or a woman who could read stories to others. But when she shared her dreams with her elder brother, Sani, he scoffed. "What use is school to a girl who will marry in a few years?" he teased, his laughter echoing into the night. Despite the discouragement, Hawa refused to give up entirely. She began sneaking over to the madrasa when her chores were finished, standing at the edges of the courtyard to listen to the teacher. She could hear the rhythmic chant of the Arabic alphabet and the murmurs of students practicing their writing. She watched as the teacher guided their hands across the slates, forming letters she could not name, but desperately wanted to. One day, her father caught her. She had been hiding near the madrasa's wall, her fingers tracing imaginary letters in the dirt. Malam Musa's booming voice startled her. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. Hawa stammered, unable to form an excuse. Her father dragged her home, berating her for wasting time. "Your duty is to this family," he barked. "Do not disgrace me with your foolishness again." After that day, Hawa's opportunities to even glimpse education vanished. Malam Musa doubled her workload, ensuring she had no time for idle pursuits. Her brothers, meanwhile, continued their studies, their evenings spent reciting verses by the glow of an oil lamp. Hawa would sit nearby, her hands busy with mending or grinding grains, listening intently to their lessons. She tried to memorize the words, repeating them silently to herself, but without guidance, her progress was slow. Her mother, Amina, sympathized but felt powerless to intervene. One evening, as they sat peeling beans together, Amina whispered to Hawa, "You have a sharp mind, my daughter, but our world is not kind to girls with dreams. Be patient. Perhaps one day you will find a way." Hawa clung to these words, though they offered little comfort. Her patience was tested daily as she watched her brothers leave for school while she remained behind, tied to a life she had not chosen. The disparity gnawed at her, fueling a growing resentment toward the limitations imposed on her. Hawa Abubakar was just beginning to navigate the uncertain years of early adolescence when her world was abruptly upended by a decision that would alter her life forever. One morning, her father, Malam Musa, summoned the family to the main room of their modest clay home. His expression was stern, his voice steady, as he announced that a marriage proposal had been made for Hawa. "The man is Alhaji Umar Danjuma," he said, stroking his gray beard as though this fact alone justified the arrangement. "He is a wealthy trader, respected in his community, and he has offered a generous bride price. This union will bring great honor to our family." Hawa's stomach churned. She had heard of Alhaji Umar. He was a man more than twice her age, known for his booming laugh and multiple wives. The thought of leaving her home, her mother, and even her laborious but familiar life to live with a stranger filled her with dread. Her mother, Amina, glanced at Hawa with a flicker of sympathy but said nothing. In their household, Amina's voice held no power against her husband's decisions. The women of Garandole were expected to obey, to endure, and to accept their fate silently. Unbeknownst to Hawa, the proposal had been in the works for weeks. Alhaji Umar had approached Malam Musa during a communal market gathering where men discussed everything from the price of livestock to potential alliances through marriage. Umar, spotting Malam Musa among the crowd, struck up a conversation about his family. After a few pleasantries, Umar made his intentions clear. "I have heard you have a young daughter," Umar said, his voice laced with confidence. "I am seeking a new wife, and I believe she would be a good match." Malam Musa, ever pragmatic, saw an opportunity. The bride price Umar offered included cattle, sacks of grains, and a modest sum of money, resources that could sustain the family through the difficult dry season. Musa accepted without consulting Amina or Hawa, as was customary. For him, the arrangement was a transaction, a means to elevate his family's status.
As we go into the most intense part of this video, kindly like and subscribe to this channel. It gives me motivation to create more videos. If you love this video and wish to see more, kindly subscribe.
When Hawa learned of the impending marriage, her first instinct was to plead with her mother. That evening, as they sat under the dim light of an oil lamp, Hawa whispered, "Mama, please, don't let this happen. I don't want to marry him." Amina's face softened, but her eyes were filled with resignation. "My child, I wish I could change this, but I cannot. Your father has decided, and in this house, his word is final." Hawa didn't give up. She approached her older brothers, hoping they might intervene on her behalf. Sani, the eldest, dismissed her concerns with a shrug. "You should be grateful, Hawa," he said. "Many girls dream of marrying a man like Alhaji Umar. He will provide for you, and you will bring honor to our family." Desperate, Hawa even tried appealing directly to her father. She knelt before him one evening, tears streaming down her face, and said, "Baba, I am not ready. Please let me stay a little longer." Malam Musa barely looked at her. "You are a woman now," he said gruffly. "It is time for you to fulfill your duty. Do not shame me with this childish behavior." Hawa realized then that her pleas would fall on deaf ears. She was a pawn in a game she had no control over, her voice drowned out by the weight of tradition and the expectations placed upon her as a girl in Garandole. The weeks leading up to the wedding were a blur of activity. Women from the village came to help Amina prepare Hawa for her new life. They braided her hair, painted intricate henna designs on her hands and feet, and gave her advice on how to please her husband. "Obey him in all things," one elderly woman advised, her tone firm. "A wife's duty is to serve her husband without question." Hawa sat silently through it all, her heart heavy with a mixture of fear and resignation. She watched as her dowry, a collection of cooking utensils, woven mats, and fabric, was carefully arranged and transported to Alhaji Umar's home. Each item felt like another nail in the coffin of her freedom. The morning of Hawa Abu Bakar's wedding dawned with the kind of bright, oppressive heat that made everything in Garandole seem even more suffocating. Women from the village bustled into her family's compound, their chatter and laughter masking the quiet despair that gripped Hawa. She sat motionless in the corner of her room, her back pressed against the wall, as a group of women surrounded her, preparing her for what they called the most important day of her life. "Smile, child," one of the older women said, her hands deftly braiding Hawa's hair. "Today is a day of joy. You are entering womanhood." Hawa felt no joy. Instead, a hollow ache consumed her as layer after layer of brightly colored fabric was draped over her small frame. Her wrists jingled with heavy gold bangles, and her face was painted with intricate patterns of white and red. The adornments were meant to make her beautiful, but to Hawa, they felt like chains, each one binding her tighter to a fate she could not escape. The wedding was a grand affair, a display of wealth and status that drew villagers from miles around. Alhaji Umar Danjuma, her groom, had spared no expense. A group of drummers played rhythmic beats that echoed through the dusty streets, while children danced and sang. Guests feasted on roasted meats, spiced rice, and bowls of steaming bean porridge, the air thick with the scent of celebration. For Hawa, the noise and activity only amplified her despair. As she was led to the ceremonial pavilion, Her head bowed under the weight of her bridal veil. She felt like a prisoner being paraded through the streets. Every step she took brought her closer to a life she did not want, to a man she did not love. Alhaji Umar, dressed in a flowing white robe and a matching cap embroidered with gold thread, greeted the crowd with a wide smile. To the villagers, he was a man of status and success, a provider who would elevate Hawa's family through their union. But to Hawa, he was a stranger, one whose presence filled her with dread. The Islamic wedding rites were brief but binding. As the imam recited the verses that sealed their union, Hawa felt a wave of numbness wash over her. When it came time for her to utter the words of consent, her voice barely escaped her lips. Her whispered "Na'am," yes, was met with cheers from the crowd, but inside, she felt as though she had just signed away her soul. The ceremony ended with blessings and prayers, the crowd dispersing to continue their celebrations. Hawa was whisked away to her new home, a sprawling compound that was impressive by village standards, but felt cold and unwelcoming to her. She was introduced to Alhaji Umar's 3 other wives, who greeted her with practiced smiles. "Welcome," one of them said softly, her eyes filled with a mixture of pity and resignation. "You are part of the family now." As the sun set and the festivities wound down, Hawa found herself alone in a room that had been prepared for her. It was filled with luxurious items, soft mats, embroidered cushions, and a large wooden chest for her belongings. But to Hawa, the room felt like a cage. Her heart raced as she heard the heavy footsteps of her new husband approaching. Alhaji Umar entered with an air of satisfaction, his wide frame filling the doorway. He closed the door behind him and smiled at her, but Hawa could not bring herself to meet his gaze. The hours that followed were a blur of fear, pain, and humiliation. Hawa had heard whispered warnings from older girls in the village about what to expect on her wedding night, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality. She felt like an object, her feelings and humanity disregarded. When it was over, Hawa lay motionless, staring at the ceiling. Her body ached, but it was the emptiness in her heart that hurt the most. She felt broken, stripped of her dignity and her dreams. In the days following the wedding, Hawa's life took on a bleak rhythm. She was expected to fulfill her duties as a wife, cooking, cleaning, and attending to her husband's needs. The other wives kept their distance, offering little more than polite conversation. Though they were kind in their way, Hawa sensed that they, too, had been shaped and silenced by the weight of their circumstances. Alhaji Umar was not cruel, but he was distant and self-assured, believing that his wealth and status entitled him to Hawa's obedience. He saw her as a possession, a young bride who would bear him children and add to his legacy. Hawa, however, felt increasingly suffocated. The walls of the compound seemed to close in on her, each day blending into the next. Her spirit, once filled with quiet defiance, began to wither under the weight of her new reality. One evening, as Hawa sat in the courtyard grinding millet, she overheard the laughter of children playing in the street. Their carefree joy was a stark contrast to her own existence. Tears welled up in her eyes as she thought about the life she had dreamed of, a life where she could learn, grow, and choose her own path. That night, alone in her room, Hawa allowed herself to cry for the first time since the wedding. She cried for the childhood that had been stolen from her, for the dreams that had been crushed, and for the woman she would never become. But as the tears subsided, something inside her shifted. Beneath the grief and despair, a spark of anger began to burn. She realized that no one was coming to save her, that if she wanted to reclaim her life, she would have to find the strength to act. In that moment, Hawa made a silent vow. She would not let this be the end of her story. The wedding had broken her, but it had also awakened something powerful within her, a determination to fight for her freedom, no matter the cost. The grand celebrations of the wedding had faded, leaving her with the stark reality of her new life. Each morning began before dawn, her tasks dictated by the unrelenting demands of the household. From fetching water to grinding millet, her day was filled with physical labor. her body aching under the weight of expectations. But it wasn't the work that wore Hawa down. It was the oppressive silence of her existence. The compound, though large and well-furnished, felt more like a prison. Alhaji Umar, her much older husband, was a looming presence, his voice commanding, his expectations unyielding. For him, Hawa was little more than a vessel to continue his lineage, a young bride added to his growing household for status and utility. In the compound, Hawa quickly learned her place within the hierarchy of wives. Alhaji Umar's first wife, Kulu, was the matriarch, a woman hardened by years of experience. She managed the household with an iron grip, overseeing the other wives and ensuring they fulfilled their roles. Kulu was not unkind, but she was distant, her interactions with Hawa marked by a quiet resignation. "She will learn," Kulu told one of the other wives, barely acknowledging Hawa's presence. "We all did." The second wife, Safia, was more approachable but offered little solace. She had once been the youngest wife and now saw Hawa as both a rival and a burden. Safia's sharp tongue and condescending remarks were a constant reminder of Hawa's position as the least experienced and most vulnerable. The third wife, Maryam, was gentle but withdrawn, her spirit subdued by years of enduring the same fate that now befell Hawa. She occasionally offered Hawa small gestures of kindness, a word of advice, a helping hand with chores, but even these were rare. Among the wives, there was little camaraderie, only a shared understanding of their collective plight. They were bound together by tradition and circumstance, each one navigating her own silent misery. The isolation was unbearable. Hawa missed her family, even though they had been complicit in her marriage. She longed for the familiar comfort of her mother's voice, the laughter of her siblings, and the bustling life of her village. But no one came to visit her. In Garandole, a married woman was expected to adapt to her husband's household without complaint or nostalgia for her past life. At night, when the compound grew quiet, Hawa would lie awake, staring at the ceiling of her small room. Her thoughts raced with memories of the dreams she once had. To learn, to explore, to live a life of her own choosing. Now those dreams felt like distant echoes, impossible and out of reach. She dreaded the moments when Alhaji Umar would call for her. Though he was not physically abusive, his treatment of her was devoid of tenderness or understanding. For him, Hawa was an obligation fulfilled, a duty performed. She felt like a possession, an object to be used and discarded at will. Despite her misery, Hawa was expected to perform her duties as a wife without complaint. She cooked meals for the household, cleaned the compound, and served her husband with quiet obedience. Any sign of defiance or dissatisfaction would be seen as a failure to uphold her role. Villagers who visited the compound often praised Hawa for her beauty and youth, speaking about her as though she were an achievement rather than a person. "Alhaji Umar is lucky," they would say. "He has found himself a jewel." Hawa wanted to scream at their ignorance, to tell them that she was not lucky, that her marriage was not a blessing but a curse. But she held her tongue, knowing that no one would listen. As the days turned into weeks, Hawa's misery deepened. The weight of her circumstances threatened to crush her, leaving her feeling more like a shadow than a person. But beneath her despair, a quiet defiance began to grow. She could not continue living this way, trapped in a marriage that stripped her of her identity and freedom. The breaking point came when Umar hosted a post-wedding celebration. Hawa overheard a conversation that would change everything. The men were speaking with enthusiasm, laughing and joking. And then, she heard the words that cut deep into her heart. "Your daughter is so lucky. You've made a fine match for her. She'll want for nothing with such a good man. Marriage will bring you prosperity." At those words, something inside Hawa snapped. She had known, of course, that her marriage had been arranged for practical reasons, that her father saw her as little more than a bargaining chip to secure status and wealth. But hearing it spoken so openly, hearing the praise heaped upon her father for giving her away like a prize, was too much. The rage that had been simmering inside her erupted, hot and fast. How could they all be so blind to the reality of her life? How could they all applaud a union that had stolen her freedom and her future? Rage boiled within her as she thought of her lost dreams. It was during this time she learned of a rat infestation in the storeroom, brought to her by the male servant. "The storeroom is crawling with rats," one of them said. "They've gotten into the grain, and now there's no way to keep it from spoiling." The mention of rats caught Hawa's attention immediately. Her eyes narrowed as the words began to form in her mind. Rats. Poison. The idea was dark, twisted, but it felt strangely like a lifeline. A way to regain control when everything else was spiraling out of her grasp. Hawa's thoughts began to race. She had heard of rat poison before, of course. It was common in rural areas to deal with rodent infestations, but it had never occurred to her that it could be used for anything other than its intended purpose. Now, as she thought about it, the idea settled in her mind with unsettling clarity. The poison would be the perfect tool, not just to rid the storeroom of rats, but to rid her life of the torment that had consumed it. Hawa asked Umar's 7-year-old niece to fetch rat poison under the pretext of addressing the infestation. The girl complied, unsuspecting of Hawa's true intentions. Hawa mixed the poison into the bean paste she was preparing for the celebration meal. As the guests ate, a few noticed the odd taste of the food. Umar, however, ate heartily. Soon after, he fell ill, his face contorted in pain. 3 other guests who had consumed the poisoned dish collapsed as well. Panic spread, and the celebration turned into chaos. Umar and 3 others succumbed to the poison, while 10 others were hospitalized. Hawa's quiet demeanor raised suspicions, and when questioned by the police, she confessed, citing her despair over the forced marriage. Her father, upon hearing the news, was livid, not with himself, but with Hawa, for dishonoring the family. Hawa was taken into custody, a scared child surrounded by armed men who treated her as a criminal. She signed a confession in English, a language she could not understand, with her thumbprint. News of the incident spread, sparking outrage and debate across the country. Hawa's case divided public opinion. Some saw her as a victim of systemic abuse, forced into an untenable situation. Others viewed her as a cold-blooded murderer who had taken 4 lives. Human rights organizations began rallying around her cause, while local villagers demanded justice for the dead. In court, the prosecution relied heavily on her confession. Witnesses, including Umar's niece and a neighbor who had tasted the poisoned food, testified against her. However, Hawa's lawyer, a fierce advocate for girls' rights, argued that she was a victim of forced marriage and cultural oppression. After months of hearings, the judge ruled to drop the charges, citing flaws in the prosecution's case and acknowledging the mitigating circumstances of Hawa's forced marriage. Human rights activists cheered the decision, while others left the courtroom muttering about injustice. With the help of Hawa's lawyer, she will no longer be sentenced to death, a call that almost seemed inevitable. Hawa's case became a rallying cry for reform in northern Nigeria. Activists used her story to campaign against child marriage, demanding better education and stricter laws to protect girls. Hawa, now free but forever scarred, became a symbol of resilience and the cost of breaking silence. This is not just Hawa's story. It is the story of thousands of girls trapped in a cycle of poverty and tradition. Through her pain, a conversation began, and though progress is slow, her voice continues to echo. However, this doesn't look like stopping anytime soon, as a then-serving Nigeria senator also married a 13-year-old Egyptian girl in one of the most publicized child marriages in the country. Have you ever wondered what life is like for a young child married to a Muslim imam? Behind this story, there are secrets you may have never imagined, secrets that will leave you bewildered. In this video, we will take an in-depth look into a world where ancient traditions and customs will surprise you. Even though women's rights are now widely advocated for and protected, especially in the Western world, there are still places where women have little or no voice. Some Muslim women have little or no say in practices such as the virginity test, a procedure conducted to determine if a girl is a virgin before she is sent to her husband's house. In cases where she is found not to be a virgin, she is often ostracized or faces severe consequences. Even acts like speaking to or shaking hands with a man outside of her family are often met with disdain. Child marriage remains a harsh reality in some communities, seemingly upheld by ancient beliefs, with the child's own family sometimes in full support, regardless of the emotional trauma and pain it may cause for the child. This is the story of Halima, a child forced into motherhood at the tender age of 11. She was married off to a wealthy imam who already had 3 wives. Recounting these events brings tears to my eyes. No child should ever have to endure this kind of hardship. Children are children. They should not be forced to play the role of adults. In the quiet town of Arzin in northern Morocco, people still speak in hushed tones about Halima, a tale of innocence lost, of childhood crushed under the weight of adult demands. Arzin, with its rolling hills and ancient alleys, is where Halima's life began and where it ended. This town, which once felt familiar and comforting, became the setting for an ordeal that would haunt its residents. Halima's life began simply, amid the gentle rhythms of rural Morocco. The town was small, its streets lined with earthen homes, its people bonded by a shared, modest life. In Arzin, everyone knew everyone else, and most families, like Halima's, depended on the land for survival. Halima's family was well respected despite their limited means. Her father, Youssef, was a man rooted in tradition, a local farmer who worked tirelessly from dawn until the sun set. Youssef cultivated crops the way his father had, using nothing more than his hands, simple tools, and the wisdom passed down through generations. For him, life was about providing for his family, and he took pride in the sweat and toil that sustained them. Halima was his only daughter, a small, bright-eyed girl with an inquisitive mind and a quiet demeanor. Her days were filled with helping her mother, Mariam, with chores and learning the family's herbal medicine trade. Mariam was known throughout Arzin for her healing abilities. The townspeople often sought her out for remedies, from coughs and colds to more serious ailments, and Mariam's skills had been inherited from her own mother, passed down like a sacred trust. Halima watched in awe as her mother identified each plant with certainty, mixing leaves, roots, and oils into healing potions. She was an attentive student, picking up her mother's craft with eagerness and care. Mariam often spoke to her daughter about the importance of helping others, of the power of nature's gifts, and the responsibility that came with such knowledge. Life was peaceful, if not entirely carefree. Halima's family, though bonded by love, was a family of limited resources. With 4 sons to feed and clothe, the household often faced tough times. Youssef's crops were at the mercy of the seasons, and some years were harder than others. The family lived humbly, surviving on what they grew, and the little income Mariam made from her herbal medicine practice. Still, Halima was content in her world, surrounded by her siblings and protected by her parents' care. She dreamed of a future where she could carry on her mother's legacy and one day pass it on to her own children. Despite the hardships, Halima's childhood held moments of joy. She would often join her brothers in the fields, playing games under the open sky, her laughter blending with the sounds of nature. She was close to her brothers, especially her youngest brother, Amin, who was only 2 years younger than her. The two shared an unbreakable bond, spending hours exploring the countryside, finding hidden paths and secret spots. She loved the smell of the soil, the rustle of the leaves, and the endless expanse of the fields that seemed to promise endless freedom. For her, Arzin was the whole world, a place where she felt safe and loved. But as Halima grew older, she began to notice that life in Arzin held limitations, particularly for girls. Her mother, though respected for her herbal knowledge, was rarely seen in public gatherings and often remained in the background, tending to the family and her work quietly. Halima saw that her future too seemed predetermined, tied to the family traditions and expectations of the community. Yet, she held on to her childhood dreams, believing that perhaps, one day, she would make her own path. Halima's innocence, her spirit, and her family's love defined her early years. But these years of quiet contentment and simple joys would be short-lived. Unbeknownst to her, fate was preparing to take her down a path that would challenge everything she knew and test the strength of her spirit in ways she could never have imagined. The first time Sheikh Ibrahim, the Imam, came to Arzin, it was an ordinary day. For most people in town, his visit was unremarkable. A respected figure from the city, someone beyond their daily lives, simply passing through. Arzin didn't often see people of his status. He was well known in urban religious circles, revered for his knowledge of Islamic law, and admired for his wealthy lifestyle. The townspeople observed him with a mix of curiosity and respect as he arrived at Halima's family home. He was tall, imposing, with a stern face and eyes that seemed to look right through people, leaving them feeling small. To Halima, who watched quietly from behind her mother, he seemed like a stranger from another world. Someone who could never belong to the simple life she knew. Sheikh Ibrahim had come to see Mariam for her herbal remedies. Though he was an imam, he held a respect for traditional healing methods, and he'd heard from acquaintances that Mariam's skills were well regarded. As he entered the home, his presence filled the small space, his voice deep and commanding. He was polite but distant, focusing on the purpose of his visit and asking Mariam questions about her work with herbs. Mariam explained each plant and its purpose, the remedies she crafted for common ailments, and how she balanced her work with raising her children. Throughout the conversation, Sheikh Ibrahim's attention drifted toward Halima, who sat quietly by her mother, watching her with a respectful and curious gaze. Her youth, her shy demeanor, and her gentle manners struck him in a way that he hadn't expected. She was not like the other children he had seen in the city, who often seemed bold and distracted. Halima seemed focused, disciplined, and, in his eyes, unusually beautiful for her age. There was something about her innocence, her unguarded nature, that stirred an interest in him. Initially, Halima's parents didn't think much of the imam's attention toward their daughter. They were grateful for his visit and eager to help him with whatever he needed. But as the days passed, Sheikh Ibrahim found reasons to return to their home. Sometimes he would request more medicine. Other times, he would simply come to visit under the pretense of needing advice on health matters. Each time, he would engage in conversation with Mariam, but his gaze would linger on Halima. Yusuf and Mariam, still respectful of his status and unsure of his intentions, felt honored by his visits. For them, it was a matter of pride to host a man of such high religious standing. Yet, in the background, Halima began to sense his unusual interest. She noticed the way he looked at her, the questions he asked her parents about her daily life, her work with her mother, and even her dreams. The attention made her uncomfortable, though she couldn't fully understand why. She was too young to grasp the implications of his interest, but she felt a growing sense of unease, a feeling she couldn't quite put into words. She tried to avoid his gaze, to keep herself busy with chores whenever he visited, but his presence in their home left her feeling tense and uncertain. As his visits continued, whispers started circulating in Arzin. People began to notice that the imam, a man of wealth and power, had taken a peculiar interest in this young girl from a modest farming family. Some speculated that he intended to help the family financially, while others guessed he might want to take Halima as a servant for his household. Yet, the more perceptive villagers sensed something more, an unsettling possibility that was almost too disturbing to voice aloud. For the first time in her life, Halima felt the weight of being observed, of being noticed in a way that made her question her own innocence and her place in her family's world. It was the beginning of a shift in her life, an unspoken tension that foreshadowed the difficult path that lay ahead. As Sheikh Ibrahim's visits to Halima's family became more frequent, he finally brought forward the real reason for his interest. One evening, after discussing remedies with Mariam, he turned to Yusuf and spoke plainly. He wanted to marry their daughter, Halima. The words, spoken with such ease, stunned both parents. They had known of child marriages in other communities, but it was not something they had considered for their own daughter, especially at her tender age of just 11. Halima's parents were caught between disbelief and discomfort. They respected the imam's authority, but felt the proposal was too much, too soon. Sheikh Ibrahim, sensing their hesitation, began to elaborate on his intentions. He spoke about the importance of honoring God's will, of how marriage was a sacred duty, and of how he could offer Halima a life of comfort, stability, and religious guidance. His words were calculated, meant to reassure them, but his true intentions remained concealed behind his carefully chosen phrases. He reminded them of religious teachings that permitted child marriage under certain conditions, quoting passages and invoking beliefs that framed his offer as a benevolent act, rather than a selfish one. At first, Yusuf and Maryam resisted, asserting that Halima was still too young. They feared for her well-being, aware that she was still a child who had not even begun to understand the world. But the imam persisted, bringing gifts each time he visited, fine cloth, coins, even rare foods that their family could rarely afford. He made promises of financial support, offering to ease the burdens of their simple life and take their daughter under his protection. His promises grew, each one more tempting than the last, as he painted a picture of security and prosperity for their family. He would send her to school, he said, ensure she was educated in religious and academic matters alike. Despite these promises, Halima's parents still struggled with the decision. They were not unaware of their own financial struggles. Yusuf had long worried about his ability to provide for all his children. The fields did not always yield enough, and Maryam's earnings from her herbal remedies were inconsistent at best. Sheikh Ibrahim's proposal offered a solution to their problems, a chance for a better life for all of them. Yet, there was a deep reluctance, especially from Maryam, who felt an instinctive protectiveness over her only daughter. Halima was precious to her, not just as a child, but as her apprentice, the girl who would one day inherit her craft. As Sheikh Ibrahim continued to visit, he wore down their resistance bit by bit. He was relentless, visiting them nearly every day, bringing new gifts, reminding them of the religious teachings that sanctioned his offer, until Yusuf and Maryam found themselves wavering. The pressure was mounting, and the imam knew it. He knew how to appeal to their sense of duty, to their faith, and most of all, to their fears about the future. Eventually, his persistence paid off, and they began to seriously consider his proposal. But there was one voice left unheard in all of this: Halima's. She was never asked how she felt, never given a choice or even the chance to express her fear and confusion. To her, the concept of marriage was a distant idea, something she associated with adults, with other people, not herself. She had no understanding of what marriage entailed, nor why someone as old as Sheikh Ibrahim would want her as a wife. She felt trapped, watching her future being decided by others, her own feelings invisible in the face of her family's growing resolve. Finally, after many sleepless nights and endless debates, Yusuf and Maryam gave in. They accepted Sheikh Ibrahim's offer, seeing it as a way to secure a future not just for Halima, but for their entire family. They believed that the imam, with his wealth and influence, could provide a life that they themselves could not. It was a decision weighed down by a mixture of hope and desperation, a choice they hoped would lead to something better, even if it meant parting with their only daughter before she was ready. Halima's fate was sealed, her childhood exchanged for promises that would ultimately bring only sorrow and tragedy. Once Halima's parents accepted Sheikh Ibrahim's proposal, the entire household was thrown into a flurry of preparations. The upcoming wedding became the talk of Arzin, a spectacle of both excitement and unease. While child marriages were not unheard of, few had expected such a union between an 11-year-old village girl and an imam from the city. For Halima, the days leading up to the wedding were filled with confusion, dread, and an overwhelming sense of powerlessness. She watched as her family bustled about, making arrangements as if she were merely a spectator in her own life. Her mother, Maryam, tried to reassure her, though her own heart was heavy. Maryam sewed Halima's wedding dress by hand, selecting a simple yet elegant fabric, a modest white cloth trimmed with delicate embroidery. Maryam had made dresses before, but this one felt different. With every stitch, she wrestled with her fears, hoping that her daughter would find happiness, or at the very least, comfort in the life ahead. She whispered quiet words to Halima about womanhood and duty, but her reassurances felt hollow, even to her. She knew, deep down, that Halima was not ready for the path she was about to walk. Yusuf, meanwhile, focused on practical matters. He negotiated with local merchants for the wedding feast, arranging for foods that would make the day memorable. While Yusuf was proud to be giving his daughter to a man of such status, he couldn't ignore the nagging guilt gnawing at him. He told himself that this was the best way to secure her future. But he, too, wondered if he was sacrificing his daughter's happiness for the family's welfare. To distract himself, he poured all his energy into preparing for the ceremony, convincing himself that a grand wedding would make up for any doubts he had. As the day approached, Sheikh Ibrahim sent more gifts, a show of his wealth and influence, meant to elevate the family's status in the eyes of the community. Golden bracelets, fine silks, and expensive perfumes arrived in carefully wrapped packages. The villagers, who rarely saw such luxury, began to look at Yusuf and Mariam with a mixture of envy and admiration. Many praised them for arranging such an advantageous marriage, while others whispered among themselves, wondering if they were making a mistake. Some even expressed concern for Halima, though no one dared to voice these concerns openly. For Halima, the gifts and the preparations were bewildering and frightening. Each new item that arrived reminded her of what was coming, and each piece of jewelry placed on her tiny wrists felt like a shackle. She had no desire for gold or perfumes. She only wanted to stay with her family, to remain a child a little while longer. Her brothers noticed her unease, especially Amin, her closest sibling, who sensed her sorrow but didn't know how to comfort her. He tried to distract her with small jokes and familiar games, but even he couldn't lift the heavy silence that had settled over her. The wedding day finally arrived. Sheikh Ibrahim, dressed in lavish robes, arrived with an entourage, bringing with him a sense of authority and opulence that felt out of place in the humble village. He greeted Yusuf and Mariam with formal respect, his demeanor a mixture of pride and satisfaction. To him, this marriage was not only a personal desire fulfilled, but also a display of his power and influence. He took pride in the fact that he could take such a young bride, seeing it as a reflection of his religious authority and his status in the community. The ceremony was modest by city standards, but extravagant for Arzin. Tables were set with dishes of lamb and rice, fruits and sweets, foods that Halima's family rarely enjoyed. Villagers gathered, some out of genuine celebration, others out of curiosity, watching as the quiet little girl in white became the imam's bride. For them, it was a spectacle, a moment that blended the strange with the familiar, the sacred with the unsettling. Some of the women, mothers and grandmothers who had once been young brides themselves, looked at Halima with a sadness that they kept hidden. They, too, had known what it felt like to be handed over too young, and they feared for what she might face. When it came time for Halima to leave with her new husband, she felt a wave of fear wash over her. Her mother held her close one last time, whispering words of comfort that were laced with sadness. Mariam told her to be strong, to trust in God's will, but Halima felt more alone than ever. Her father avoided her gaze, focusing instead on the imam, offering him formal words of gratitude. And her brothers, standing silently nearby, watched with a mix of confusion and loss, knowing that their sister's life was forever changed. As Halima was led away, she looked back at her family, her small, trembling figure framed against the familiar landscape of her childhood. She realized, in that moment, that everything she had known was now behind her. Her world had shifted irreversibly, and the life she was entering felt like a vast, frightening unknown. The celebration continued in Arzin, but for Halima, it marked the beginning of a new life, one that would test her courage and resilience in ways she was far too young to understand. Sheikh Ibrahim was a man whose life seemed steeped in power and piety. To the outside world, he was a respected religious leader, an imam with a reputation that stretched beyond Arzin to nearby towns and even cities. People revered him for his knowledge of religious texts and sought his guidance on matters both spiritual and worldly. He had held his position as an imam for many years, and his words were often taken as law. Yet, for all his respect in the public eye, The private life of Sheikh Ibrahim was complex and, for his wives and children, difficult. Sheikh Ibrahim had been married 3 times before he set his sights on Halima. Each of his wives had entered his household with hope and reverence, trusting that marriage to a man of such standing would bring them security and respect. However, life in the Imam's household was governed by rules and expectations that were as rigid as they were unyielding. For Sheikh Ibrahim, marriage was not a partnership of equals, but rather a structure where he alone held authority. His wives were expected to follow his commands without question, to live by his rules, and to carry out their duties without fail. The first wife, Fatima, had been with him the longest. She was a quiet woman, obedient and dutiful, who had accepted her role in the Imam's life without complaint. She had seen other wives come and go, each one hoping to find favor with the Imam, only to discover that his affections were fleeting. Fatima had learned to live in silence, her days spent caring for her children and managing the household according to Sheikh Ibrahim's strict orders. She rarely ventured outside without his permission, and she raised her children to be obedient, instilling in them the same deference that had defined her own life. The second wife, Aisha, had once been spirited and hopeful, drawn to the Imam by the promises of a stable life and a sense of purpose. But Aisha's vivacity had been worn down over the years by the demands of living under his authority. She had entered the marriage with dreams of contributing to the community, of working alongside her husband, perhaps teaching or helping the less fortunate. Yet, Sheikh Ibrahim had no interest in her ambitions. To him, Aisha's place was within the home, raising his children and supporting him without question. Over time, her spirit faded, her dreams slowly suffocating under the weight of her husband's control. By the time Halima entered the household, Aisha was a shadow of her former self, her once bright eyes now dulled with resignation. The third wife, Zainab, was younger and had been married to the Imam only a few years before he approached Halima's family. Unlike Fatima and Aisha, Zainab had not yet fully submitted to her role. She often questioned Sheikh Ibrahim's commands, challenging his authority in ways that angered him but also intrigued him. Zainab's defiance was met with stern discipline. He used his religious authority to remind her of her place, asserting that obedience was a wife's duty. Zainab, however, was not easily subdued, and she often argued with him, even if it meant facing consequences. For her, marriage to the Imam had been a lesson in disillusionment, an experience that had left her both resentful and isolated within the household. The children of Sheikh Ibrahim were raised under his stern guidance. They were taught to respect him without question, to obey without hesitation. The sons were expected to follow in his religious footsteps, while the daughters were groomed to be future wives, raised in the same strict environment that defined their mothers' lives. Love and affection were rare in their upbringing. Discipline and obedience were the pillars of their existence. The children respected their father out of duty, but few felt a close bond with him. He was a figure of authority rather than warmth, someone to be feared rather than confided in. For Sheikh Ibrahim, religion was both a source of comfort and a tool for control. He was deeply knowledgeable, but his interpretation of faith was rigid, leaving little room for empathy or understanding. In his eyes, his household was a model of religious adherence, a structure where his authority was absolute. He used religious texts to justify his actions, believing that his strict approach was in line with divine will. To him, his wives and children were not individuals with their own desires and dreams, but rather extensions of himself, bound to follow the path he set for them. The decision to marry Halima, an 11-year-old girl, was not driven by love or companionship. For Sheikh Ibrahim, it was a matter of pride and desire, a way to assert his status and fulfill his wishes. Halima's youth and innocence held a strange allure for him, something that he saw as both a testament to his influence and a fulfillment of his own beliefs. He viewed her as a new addition to his household, another wife who would be molded to fit his vision of an obedient partner. Her age was not a concern for him. In his mind, it was his right as a man and as an imam to take her as his wife. As the days drew closer to the wedding, Sheikh Ibrahim felt a quiet satisfaction. knowing that he would soon bring Halima into his household. To him, this marriage was a symbol of his authority, his ability to shape lives according to his will. He believed that Halima, like his other wives, would learn her place, would submit to the life he planned for her. But what Sheikh Ibrahim did not understand, what he had overlooked in his confidence, was that Halima was not like his other wives. She was a child with dreams, fears, and a spirit that had not yet been crushed by the weight of obedience. In his arrogance, he assumed that she, too, would fall in line, never considering the possibility that her innocence might hold a strength he could not foresee. The day after her wedding, Halima stepped into a world that was foreign, harsh, and far removed from the only life she had ever known. The imam's household was grand by the village's standards, filled with fine rugs, large rooms, and an air of formality that made her feel small and out of place. The servants moved about with silent efficiency, casting her fleeting glances filled with a mixture of pity and indifference. For a girl who had spent her days running freely in the fields, working alongside her mother in the small, cozy spaces of their modest home, this new environment felt cold and imposing. From the very first night, Halima was confronted with the harsh realities of her marriage. Sheikh Ibrahim was not gentle with her, treating her not as a young girl but as an adult wife, with all the expectations that entailed. The experience left her terrified, broken, and deeply confused. She cried herself to sleep, her tiny frame trembling with fear, but there was no one to comfort her, no one to ease her pain. In the days that followed, her fear only grew, turning into a heavy silence that hung over her like a shroud. She quickly learned that she could not express her pain or fear without facing stern reprimands from the imam, who expected unwavering obedience and silence from his new wife. The imam's household was governed by rules that Halima struggled to understand. She was not allowed to leave the house without permission, nor was she permitted to speak out of turn. Her movements were watched, her tasks were dictated, and any trace of her own will was swiftly subdued. Each morning, she was expected to rise before dawn, performing prayers and preparing herself for the day's duties. Her responsibilities were demanding and monotonous, a series of tasks meant to occupy her and keep her compliant. She was no longer the child who wandered freely, collecting herbs and learning her mother's craft. She had become a mere extension of the imam's household, an existence defined by her service to him. Halima's relationship with the other wives was complicated. Fatima, the oldest wife, was kind but distant, treating Halima with a detached sympathy. She often watched Halima with a knowing sadness, her gaze filled with memories of her own youth, a time when she, too, had entered the household full of fear and hope. Fatima had long since resigned herself to her role, her spirit dulled by years of submission. She offered Halima quiet guidance, small gestures of comfort, but there was little she could do to ease the young girl's suffering. Fatima had learned to survive by remaining invisible, by accepting her place without question, and she feared that encouraging Halima would only bring more harm upon them both. Aisha, the second wife, was warmer, though equally constrained by her own experiences. She treated Halima like a younger sister, sharing whispered words of advice and caution when they were alone. Aisha understood the struggles Halima faced, and though she could not openly defy the imam, she offered Halima small moments of kindness, brief reprieves from the oppressive atmosphere of the household. She warned Halima of the imam's temper, telling her to remain silent, to avoid drawing attention to herself, to survive by submitting as they all had learned to do. For Aisha, seeing Halima's pain was a reminder of her own crushed dreams, and while she wished for something better for the young girl, she felt powerless to change anything. Zainab, the third wife, was more outspoken and occasionally rebellious, though her defiance was carefully controlled. She saw Halima's innocence and youth as a stark contrast to the life they led, and it filled her with a simmering anger. Zainab was resentful of the imam and his authority, and though she did not openly challenge him, she did not hide her disdain from Halima. She would sometimes take Halima aside and speak harshly of the life they were forced to live, her words laced with bitterness. Zainab warned her not to expect any kindness from Sheikh Ibrahim, telling her that survival meant surrendering her own dreams and desires. Yet, her defiance, however subtle, gave Halima a small sense of hope, a reminder that not everyone in the household had fully submitted. The children in the household, especially those older than Halima, treated her with a mix of curiosity and indifference. They had grown up under their father's rule, accustomed to the strict environment and wary of challenging his authority. To them, Halima was just another figure in the background, a new wife who had joined the household, someone who did not yet belong. Some of the younger children, however, were drawn to her, sensing her gentle nature. They would occasionally play near her, seeking her attention, unaware of the pain she carried. For brief moments when she was with the children, Halima felt a faint echo of her own childhood, a reminder of the simple joys that had once filled her life. In the quiet moments when she was alone, Halima's mind would drift back to her family, to the fields and the warm embrace of her mother's kitchen. She longed for the days when she had been free, when her life was filled with familiar routines and the gentle presence of her family. But now, those memories felt distant, as if they belonged to someone else. She struggled to reconcile the reality of her new life with the innocence she had left behind, and a deep sadness settled within her. She prayed silently, hoping that somehow her suffering would end, though she had no clear idea of how or when. As the weeks turned into months, Halima's spirit grew quieter, her voice softer, and her will weaker. She moved through her days like a shadow, performing her duties without complaint. Her mind numbed by the repetitive tasks and the constant fear of displeasing the imam. She had come to understand that there was no escape, no reprieve from the life she had been thrust into. She was no longer a child. She had been transformed into something else, a young girl forced into the role of a wife in a world that showed her little kindness and even less mercy. In her darkest moments, Halima would sit alone, her eyes unfocused, her thoughts filled with memories of her family. She wondered if they missed her, if they regretted the choice they had made, or if they, too, had accepted her absence as part of the price for their own survival. Each night, as she lay in the cold silence of her room, she would whisper a prayer, a plea for freedom, though she did not know what that freedom would look like. All she knew was that the life she had been given was a life she could barely endure. And so each day, she drifted further into silence, her spirit worn thin by the relentless demands of a life she had never chosen. As time went on, Halima's despair deepened, turning her once bright eyes hollow and her gentle nature subdued. She lived each day under the oppressive weight of Sheikh Ibrahim's authority, her childhood memories fading, replaced by the harsh reality of her life as a young bride in his household. Her days blurred into a monotonous routine of duties, and her nights were filled with dread and silent tears. The light that had once defined her was slowly dimming, replaced by an overwhelming sense of isolation and entrapment. Her only solace came in the brief, quiet moments she could steal for herself, though even these were clouded by the knowledge that there was no escape. Despite her efforts to stay invisible, Halima's pain did not go unnoticed by the other wives. Fatima, Isha, and Zainab, though each resigned to their own burdens, shared silent glances of understanding with her. They too had once felt the same despair, the same desire for freedom that was now consuming Halima. Occasionally, Aisha or Zainab would pull her aside, offering whispered words of encouragement or guidance, but they could do little to alleviate the heavy burden she carried. They knew too well the futility of trying to change the imam's will, for they had once tried and failed. Their quiet gestures of empathy were a reminder that Halima was not alone in her suffering. But it was a small comfort in the face of her growing hopelessness. One evening, as Halima lay awake, her thoughts drifting to memories of her mother's herbal teachings, an idea began to form. She remembered the plants her mother had shown her, the ones used for ailments, but also those that could harm if used improperly. Her mother had taught her how certain herbs, when combined, could become dangerous, even lethal. Halima's mind lingered on this knowledge, a knowledge she had never thought she would need in such a way. But desperation was a powerful force, and as the days wore on, the thought grew stronger, taking root in her heart. It was terrifying. yet oddly empowering, a glimmer of control in a life where she had none. Over the next few weeks, Halima began to carefully collect the necessary ingredients, slipping small amounts of each herb into the folds of her clothing whenever she could. She was careful not to draw attention to herself, hiding the herbs in her room and mixing them only when she was alone. She moved with quiet determination, her movements slow and calculated. Each step she took toward carrying out her plan filled her with both fear and resolve. She knew the risks, understood that discovery would mean severe punishment, but her suffering had reached a point where she felt she had little left to lose. The other wives, particularly Zainab, noticed a change in Halima. Her once timid manner was now marked by a strange calmness, a quiet resolve that puzzled them. Zainab, who had always been perceptive, began to suspect that Halima was planning something, though she dared not ask. She sensed that whatever was stirring within Halima was something deeply personal, something that could not be shared. Instead, she offered Halima silent support, hoping that whatever path the young girl chose would bring her some semblance of peace. One evening, when Sheikh Ibrahim returned home after his evening prayers, Halima prepared his tea as she always did. But this time, she added the deadly mixture she had carefully crafted, stirring it into the cup with a steady hand. She moved with an uncanny calm, her face expressionless, her eyes focused on the task at hand. As she carried the tea to him, her heart pounded, but her resolve remained unshaken. She placed the cup in front of him, her hands steady, her gaze fixed downward to avoid betraying any hint of her intentions. Sheikh Ibrahim took the cup without a second thought, sipping the tea as he often did, unaware of the poison that lingered within. Halima watched from a distance, her breathing shallow as she waited for the effects to take hold. She had anticipated this moment for so long, rehearsed it in her mind until it felt almost surreal. As she observed him, a sense of numbness settled over her, a detachment from the act she had just committed. For the first time since her marriage, she felt a strange, twisted sense of freedom, though she knew it would be short-lived. But then, something shifted within her, a realization of the enormity of what she had done. She felt a surge of fear, a dread of what would come next. The village would surely learn of the imam's death, and she, the young bride, would be the first to fall under suspicion. The thought of facing the judgment of her community, the shame and horror that would follow, filled her with panic. She knew that the people of Arzin, who revered the imam, would condemn her to death, and her family, already burdened with poverty, would be left to bear the shame of her actions. Overwhelmed by the gravity of her decision, Halima made one final, desperate choice. She returned to where she had saved a portion of the deadly mixture and poured it into a cup. With trembling hands, she raised it to her lips, drinking the poison that she had prepared. As the liquid burned its way down, she closed her eyes, surrendering to the darkness that awaited her. Halima's body was discovered the next morning, lying beside the imam's lifeless form, her small frame curled in a final, silent act of defiance. The household erupted in chaos, and soon the entire village of Arzin would be consumed by the scandal and mystery surrounding the young girl's tragic end. But in that final moment, Halima had reclaimed a sliver of her life, a choice that was hers alone, even if it came at the ultimate price. The morning sun rose over Arzin, casting a quiet light over the village that had yet to wake to the tragedy waiting within Sheikh Ibrahim's home. The house, usually bustling with the sounds of servants and family members going about their daily tasks, was uncharacteristically silent. It was one of the younger children who first discovered the scene, wandering into the imam's quarters and finding both his father and Halima lying still, side by side. The child's cries echoed through the house, drawing the attention of the other wives, servants, and eventually the townspeople. The villagers gathered quickly outside the imam's home as word spread. At first, they could hardly comprehend the situation. Death had come in the night, claiming both a respected religious leader and a girl who had barely entered womanhood. The shock and disbelief hung thick in the air as neighbors exchanged fearful glances and whispered questions. The imam was a powerful figure, and his death was both a personal tragedy for the community and a symbolic blow to the authority he represented. But alongside the grief, a murmur of suspicion began to rise. How could both the imam and his young bride have died in the same night? What darkness had touched their lives so suddenly? Inside the house, the scene was stark and haunting. Sheikh Ibrahim's body lay motionless, his face frozen in an expression of shock and pain, evidence of the poison's cruel effect. Next to him lay Halima, her small form curled up as if in sleep, her face bearing a calmness that belied the turmoil that had defined her last days. Her hands were clasped over her chest, and for a moment she looked like a child resting peacefully. But to those who knew the truth, it was clear that this was no peaceful end. It was the final act of a girl who had been pushed beyond her limits. The wives gathered around, each one responding in her own way. Fatima, the oldest, knelt beside Halima's lifeless body, tears silently streaming down her face. She had known the suffering of a young bride all too well, had seen Halima's innocence shattered, and now felt the weight of a guilt she could not fully express. Aisha, standing to the side, clutched her hands to her chest, whispering prayers for Halima's soul, her mind racing with memories of the kindness she had tried to offer the girl. Zainab, however, felt a bitter mixture of sorrow and vindication. She had long resented the imam's power, his control over their lives, and while she mourned Halima's tragic end, she could not ignore the sense of justice she felt in the imam's death. For her, this final act was not just a tragedy, it was a reckoning. As the elders and local physician arrived, they began to assess the situation. The physician took samples and examined them further, and after a careful analysis, he confirmed his fears. Both the imam and the young girl had ingested a deadly concoction, most likely a carefully prepared herbal poison. Halima's small, fragile body showed similar signs of poisoning as Sheikh Ibrahim's, though her expression in death was strangely peaceful, as if she had accepted her fate. The discovery of poisoning as the cause of death sent a shockwave through Arzin. People now knew that this was no accident, no mysterious illness. This was a deliberate act. Outside, the crowd grew, and people began speculating openly. Some defended Halima, saying that no child should be forced into such a life, that she had been a victim of circumstances beyond her control. Others condemned her, speaking of the imam's respect and authority, asserting that she had dishonored not only him but the entire village. The elders, too, found themselves divided, unsure of how to proceed. This was not merely a family tragedy. It was a crisis that shook the community's faith in its own traditions, its practices, and the trust it had placed in its religious leaders. As the day wore on, the villagers struggled to make sense of what had happened, and grief gave way to a painful reflection. Halima's death, though wrapped in scandal, became a mirror for the people of Arzin, forcing them to confront the harsh reality of child marriage and the power dynamics that had enabled it. While some clung to their beliefs, insisting that the imam had acted within his rights, others began to question whether such practices should continue. Was it right to marry off a child, to impose a life of submission and suffering upon someone who had not yet fully lived? For the first time, voices of dissent began to rise, not loudly, but with a quiet persistence that hinted at a potential shift. The village leaders, under pressure from both sides, decided to handle the matter delicately. They declared that Halima's actions would not be judged in the same way as an adult's. Instead, they chose to honor her life in silence, allowing her family to mourn without public condemnation. For Sheikh Ibrahim, however, a grand funeral was arranged, marking him as a revered figure whose death would be remembered with solemnity. Yet, beneath the formalities, the villagers knew that the imam's legacy had been irrevocably tainted by the circumstances of his death. His authority, once unquestioned, had now become a subject of whispered doubts. As the day came to an end, Halima was laid to rest beside her family's humble plot, away from the grandness of the imam's tomb. Her family, stricken by grief, buried her with quiet dignity, their sorrow marked by a mixture of regret and love. Her mother, Mariam, felt the weight of her daughter's loss most acutely, haunted by the knowledge that her own teachings of herbal medicine had in a way led to this end. Yusuf, her father, stood silently, his face a mask of sorrow, wondering if his decision to marry her off had been worth the cost. In the days that followed, life in Arzin returned to its quiet rhythms, but Halima's story lingered in the hearts and minds of its people. Her death became a point of reflection, a quiet protest against the unquestioned practices that had defined their lives. The tragedy of Halima's short life would not be easily forgotten. Her final act had stirred something within the community, planting a seed of doubt that would grow over time, challenging the very foundations upon which Arzin's customs were built. For the women of the village, especially the wives and daughters, Halima's story became a whispered tale of resilience and quiet rebellion. Mothers began to question the futures they had planned for their daughters, and young girls looked to Halima's memory as a reminder of their own desires for freedom. Though she was gone, Halima's spirit had left a mark, a legacy that lived on as a silent challenge to the ways of old. She had taken control of her fate in the only way she could, and in doing so had left an unspoken call for change that the people of Arzin could no longer ignore. In the United States, a 13-year-old girl is typically in the 8th grade, engaging in subjects such as math, language arts, health education, music, and others. Same applies to other countries. In some regions, however, a 13-year-old girl child may find herself shouldering immense responsibilities. She may be forced to fend for herself due to her parents' inability to provide for the family. This often leads her to hawk goods on the streets, sacrificing her education and innocence. Tragically, many girls in such situations lack basic knowledge and skills, unable to navigate their own lives effectively. They face horrific abuses, including sexual exploitation by guardians or relatives. This is the story of Clara. Born into an impoverished home, she was sexually assaulted by her uncle, her mother's immediate elder brother. This vile act resulted in her becoming pregnant at a tender age, even when her organs were not fully developed. Clara's life was fraught with challenges that no child should have to endure. Ultimately, she died during childbirth, a tragedy that left hospital staff in tears as they grappled with the loss of a young girl who had so much potential ahead of her. What makes this documentary even more tragic is that Clara's uncle had a wife and 3 young daughters of his own, one of whom was around Clara's age. The betrayal and abuse Clara faced highlight a disturbing reality that many young girls endure, one that is often overlooked or ignored by society. The question remains, how would authorities react to such heinous acts? Will they let it slide?
Clara's early years were defined by hardship and resilience. Born into a family struggling under the weight of poverty, Clara was the youngest of 3 children. Her father, Miguel, had left the family when Clara was just a toddler, leaving her mother, Rosa, to shoulder the responsibility of raising 3 children alone. Rosa worked tirelessly as a domestic helper in the homes of wealthier families, earning just enough to keep food on the table. The family's home was a modest structure of wooden planks with a rusted tin roof that leaked during heavy rains. Inside, a single room served as a bedroom for the entire family. Despite these challenges, Clara found joy in the simple things: playing in the fields with her siblings, helping her mother cook over an open flame, and listening to stories from her elderly neighbor, Doña Esmeralda, who often spoke of hope and perseverance. Clara's small village had only one school, a crumbling building with peeling paint and broken desks. But to Clara, it was a sanctuary. She loved to learn, excelling in subjects like reading and mathematics. Her teachers often remarked on her determination and natural intelligence, calling her La Estrella, the star of the class. Despite her hunger and the long walk to school each day, Clara dreamed of a brighter future, one where she could become a nurse and help others. Her relationship with her siblings was close but strained by their circumstances. Her older brother, Luis, often worked odd jobs to contribute to the family income, while her sister Camila dropped out of school to help Rosa with chores. Clara, being the youngest, was shielded from some responsibilities, but often felt the weight of her family's struggles. Rosa was a stern but loving mother, doing her best to instill values of honesty and hard work in her children. She often spoke of her brother, Mariano, who lived in the nearby town and had achieved success. Rosa would tell stories of how Mariano had started as a mechanic's apprentice and eventually opened his own workshop. These stories filled Clara with admiration and a sense of pride for her uncle, whom she had only met a handful of times. As Clara approached her teenage years, her world began to shift. Rosa's health started to deteriorate due to long hours of physical labor, and providing for the family became increasingly difficult. Rosa's dreams of giving her children a better life seemed to slip further away with each passing day. Mariano Villalba was the embodiment of success in his family's eyes. Born and raised in the same impoverished village of San Esteban as his younger sister Rosa, he had risen above the limitations of their shared beginnings. With ambition and determination, he had learned the trade of mechanics as a teenager, eventually saving enough money to open his own workshop in Santa Rosita, a bustling town just an hour's drive from their village. By the time Clara was 14, Mariano was a respected figure in the community, known for his hard work, well-kept home, and strong family. Mariano's wife, Luciana, played a significant role in his success. Together, they had built a life that many in the family envied. Their house was spacious and neatly painted, with a garden filled with blooming flowers and a modern kitchen, a luxury in the area. Mariano and Luciana had 3 daughters: Isabella, 15, a confident and outgoing girl; Sofia, 12, a budding artist; and Camila, a playful 7-year-old who adored her older sisters. They were a picture-perfect family, admired by neighbors and extended relatives alike. Mariano often visited San Esteban to maintain his connection with his roots. On one such visit, he found Rosa in a state of exhaustion, her face etched with worry. Her health was declining from years of labor, and the strain of raising her children alone was evident. Rosa confided in Mariano about her struggles, particularly her inability to provide Clara with opportunities to pursue her education. Sensing an opportunity to give back to his family, Mariano proposed what seemed like a noble solution. He suggested that Clara come live with his family in Santa Rosita. There, she would have access to better schools, nutritious meals, and a stable environment. He assured Rosa that Clara would be treated as one of his own children, given the same care and privileges as his daughters. "Rosa, let me help her," Mariano said with conviction, placing a firm hand on her shoulder. "She deserves more than what San Esteban can offer. With us, she'll have a chance to succeed. You can't let her talents go to waste." Rosa hesitated. The idea of sending her youngest child away filled her with dread. But she knew Mariano was right. Clara's intelligence and drive were a beacon of hope for the family. Rosa believed this was the only way for Clara to break free from the cycle of poverty that had trapped them for generations. When Rosa told Clara about Mariano's offer, Clara felt a mix of emotions. The thought of leaving her mother, siblings, and the familiarity of San Esteban frightened her. But the promise of a better education and a chance to pursue her dream of becoming a nurse filled her with excitement. Mariano's confident demeanor and warm assurances gave her a sense of security she rarely experienced. "Clara, this is your chance," Rosa told her, holding her hands tightly. "You can do great things. Mariano and Luciana will take good care of you." A week later, Mariano arrived in his pickup truck to take Clara to Santa Rosita. The entire family gathered to say their goodbyes. Rosa hugged her daughter tightly, whispering words of encouragement through her tears. Clara's siblings stood silently, torn between sadness and hope for their sister's future. The drive to Santa Rosita was overwhelming for Clara. It was her first time leaving the village, and she marveled at the bustling streets, the rows of shops, and the vibrant energy of the town. Mariano spoke kindly during the journey, telling her about the school she would attend and the new friends she would make. He painted a picture of a promising future, assuring her that she would thrive under his care. When they arrived at Mariano's home, Clara was awestruck. The house was unlike anything she had ever seen. A two-story structure with bright white walls, a tiled roof, and a small fountain in the garden. Luciana greeted her warmly, pulling her into a hug and introducing her to the girls, who seemed just as curious about their new cousin as she was about them. "Welcome to your new home, Clara," Luciana, Mariano's wife, said with a smile. "We're so happy to have you here." Clara was given her own room, a cozy space with a bed, a desk, and a window overlooking the garden. That night, as she lay in bed, Clara felt a sense of hope she hadn't felt in years. She believed she was stepping into a new chapter of her life, one filled with opportunities and the support of a loving family. Unbeknownst to her, the promise Mariano had made to her mother would soon unravel, revealing a far darker reality than anyone could have imagined. Clara's arrival at her Uncle Mariano's home in Santa Rosita marked the start of what she believed was a brighter future. For the first time, she was surrounded by the comforts she had only dreamed of. The house, with its polished wooden floors, spacious rooms, and modern amenities, was a stark contrast to her small, crumbling home in San Esteban. Clara felt both awe and gratitude as she began to settle into this new chapter of her life. Luciana, Mariano's wife, welcomed Clara with open arms. She was a kind and gentle woman, always dressed impeccably, reflecting her role as the matriarch of a well-off household. Luciana treated Clara warmly, immediately making her feel like part of the family. She introduced Clara to her daughters, Isabella, Sofia, and Camila, who were initially curious but quickly embraced Clara as their cousin. "Clara, this is your home now," Luciana said, showing her to her room. "If you ever need anything, just let me know." Clara's room was modest compared to the rest of the house, but felt luxurious to her. It had a small wooden desk, a wardrobe, and a window overlooking the garden where flowers bloomed in vibrant colors. On her bed lay a fresh set of sheets and a neatly folded blanket, gestures that made her feel cared for. The following day, Luciana took Clara shopping for new clothes and school supplies. Clara, unused to such attention, was overwhelmed but grateful. For the first time in her life, she owned a pair of sturdy shoes and a school bag. Luciana's daughters accompanied them, giggling and chatting, and Clara felt a sense of belonging she hadn't experienced before. Clara's first day at her new school was both exciting and intimidating. The building was far larger and more modern than the small, dilapidated schoolhouse in San Esteban. She wore a crisp new uniform and carried a satchel filled with notebooks and pencils, items she had once considered luxuries. Her classmates were friendly but curious about the quiet girl from the countryside. Clara quickly proved herself to be intelligent and hard-working, earning the praise of her teachers. She particularly excelled in science, and her dream of becoming a nurse seemed closer than ever. However, Clara's transition wasn't without its challenges. While her cousins, especially Isabella, helped her adjust to the school's culture, Clara often felt out of place. She spoke with a slight rural accent, which some of her peers teased her about, and she struggled to keep up with the advanced curriculum initially. Despite this, Clara's determination never wavered. At home, Clara quickly adapted to her new routine. Mornings were busy with everyone preparing for school or work, and evenings were all about family dinners where Mariano often shared stories about his day at the workshop. Luciana ensured the meals were plentiful and delicious, a far cry from the sparse dinners Clara had grown up with. Mariano was a reserved yet commanding figure in the household. He was deeply respected by his family, and his daughters idolized him. To Clara, he seemed like the perfect father figure, strict but fair. He frequently asked about her studies and praised her achievements, making her feel valued. "Clara, you're doing great," Mariano said one evening as they sat in the living room. "Keep this up and you'll have a bright future ahead of you." At first, Mariano's attention seemed supportive. He would often help Clara with her homework or offer advice on how to excel in school. Clara, still adjusting to her new life, appreciated his guidance and saw him as a mentor. Despite the warmth and security of Mariano's home, subtle tensions began to surface. Clara noticed how Luciana seemed to watch Mariano closely when he interacted with her. While Mariano's attention seemed paternal, Luciana's protective instincts were evident. She would often remind Clara to spend more time with the girls and less time alone with Mariano, though she never openly expressed her concerns. For the first few months, life in Mariano's home seemed very good. But beneath the surface of this new beginning, cracks were forming. Mariano's attention, once supportive, began to feel more controlling. Luciana's warmth, though genuine, was tinged with concern she kept to herself. Clara, though unaware of the storm brewing around her, sensed that her perfect new life was not as secure as it seemed. Mariano's behavior became increasingly difficult to ignore. He started creating reasons to spend time alone with Clara. On weekends, he would offer to help her with her studies, insisting they work in his home office rather than at the dining table where the rest of the family gathered. He would drive her to and from school, even when Luciana or the girls could have easily done so. At first, Clara appreciated the attention, seeing it as proof that Mariano cared about her success. However, his tone often carried a weight she couldn't quite place. When they were alone, Mariano's compliments became more frequent and personal. He began to comment on how lucky she was to live with them and how much he had sacrificed to give her a better life. "You should always be grateful, Clara," he would say. "Not everyone would do what I've done for you." These remarks left Clara feeling indebted, as though she owed Mariano something beyond the gratitude she already expressed. She found herself avoiding him when she could, seeking solace in Luciana's company or spending more time with Isabella and Sofia. Luciana was not blind to her husband's behavior. She noticed how Mariano's demeanor changed when Clara was around, his over-eagerness to involve himself in her life, the way his eyes followed her movements. While she couldn't prove anything, her intuition told her something was wrong. Luciana began creating subtle boundaries to protect Clara. She encouraged Clara to spend more time with the girls and less time alone with Mariano. When Mariano suggested taking Clara to the workshop to show her how the business operated, Luciana insisted she tag along with the younger girls, turning it into a family outing. "Mariano, don't overwhelm Clara," Luciana said one evening when he insisted on quizzing her about school. "She's just a child. Let her have some space." Mariano brushed off Luciana's concerns, claiming he was merely helping Clara succeed. However, Luciana's words hinted at an underlying tension, and Clara could sense it. Over time, Mariano began to isolate Clara subtly. He discouraged her from spending too much time with her friends, saying it was better for her to focus on her studies. He would insist on knowing where she was at all times and began questioning her about conversations she had with others, including Luciana.
As we go into the most intense part of this video, kindly like and subscribe to this channel. It gives me motivation to create more videos. If you love this video and wish to see more, kindly subscribe.
One day, when Clara mentioned that her science teacher had praised her in class, Mariano's response startled her. "You shouldn't rely on anyone's approval but mine," he said, his tone sharper than usual. "I'm the one who gave you this opportunity. Don't forget that." These words left Clara feeling trapped. The gratitude she once felt for Mariano's generosity now felt like a chain, binding her to his expectations. She began withdrawing from those around her, unsure of how to voice her growing discomfort. The household was unusually quiet on the evening it happened. Luciana and the girls were out visiting a neighbor for a birthday celebration, and Mariano had stayed behind, citing exhaustion from work. Clara had planned to attend the gathering with the family, but a lingering headache had kept her home. She had assured Luciana she would rest and catch up on schoolwork, never anticipating how drastically her world was about to change. The evening began innocently enough. Clara sat at the dining table, her textbooks spread out before her, trying to focus on her studies. The stillness of the house felt heavy, the silence broken only by the occasional hum of the refrigerator or the distant barking of a dog outside. Mariano entered the room, his footsteps soft on the polished floor. Clara looked up and offered a polite smile. "Still studying?" he asked, his tone unusually warm. "Yes, Tio," Clara replied, keeping her focus on the page before her. Mariano pulled out a chair and sat across from her, watching her for a moment before speaking again. "You work so hard," he said, his voice low. "You're such a smart girl. I'm proud of you." Clara murmured a quiet "thank you" and turned her attention back to her notebook, hoping the conversation would end there. But Mariano didn't move. Mariano's presence began to feel oppressive as he leaned forward, placing his elbows on the table. His compliments became more personal, and his tone shifted from casual to something more intense. "You've grown up so much since you came here," he said, his eyes lingering on her face. "You're not like those silly girls at school. You're mature, special." Clara's stomach tightened. She tried to hide her discomfort, offering a nervous smile as she gathered her papers, pretending to organize them. "Thank you, Tio. I think I'll finish this in my room," she said, standing up quickly. Before she could leave, Mariano reached out and grabbed her wrist. The suddenness of the gesture made her heart race. "Wait," he said, his grip firm but not painful. "Why are you in such a hurry?" "I just want to talk." Clara froze, unsure of how to respond. Mariano's grip loosened, but he didn't let go entirely. His expression softened, but there was something in his eyes that made Clara feel exposed and vulnerable. "You know, I've done so much for you," he began, his voice quieter now. "I've given you everything, a home, a chance at a better life. You're like my own daughter. But sometimes—" He trailed off, his gaze drifting over her in a way that made Clara's skin crawl. I'm really grateful, Tio." Clara stammered, taking a small step back. "I'll never forget what you've done for me." Mariano stood up, closing the distance between them. Clara's heart pounded as she realized the exit was behind him. "You're special to me, Clara," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're not just another girl. You're different." Before Clara could react, Mariano placed his hands on her shoulders. The gesture, though seemingly innocent, felt suffocating. Clara's instincts screamed at her to get away. "Please, Tio," she said, her voice trembling. "I need to go." Mariano's grip tightened, his expression shifting from affectionate to something darker. "You don't have to be afraid," he said. "I would never hurt you. You're safe with me." Tears welled up in Clara's eyes as she struggled to pull away. The tension in the room was unbearable, the air thick with unspoken threats. In seconds, Mariano forced Clara into an uncompromising situation and forced Clara to do his will. A painful act Clara will never forget. As Clara tried to scream, he covered her mouth. He continued this bastardly act for minutes, and Clara soon stopped yelling, as yelling didn't seem like stopping Mariano's devilish act. After satisfying his forbidden desire, he released Clara abruptly, stepping back as if nothing had happened. "You should get some rest," he said casually, his tone returning to normal. He turned and walked out of the room, leaving Clara trembling and gasping for breath. That night, Clara lay in bed, unable to sleep. Her mind raced, replaying the incident over and over. She felt a mix of fear, shame, and confusion. Had she done something to provoke him? Was it her fault? She wanted to tell Luciana but was terrified of the consequences. What if no one believed her? What if it made things worse? Mariano's behavior in the days following the incident was unnervingly normal. He acted as though nothing had happened, laughing and joking with the family as usual. But Clara could feel his eyes on her whenever they were in the same room. Luciana, though unaware of what had transpired, sensed Clara's unease. She noticed how Clara avoided being alone with Mariano and how her usually bright demeanor had dimmed. One evening, as they washed dishes together, Luciana gently asked, "Clara, is everything okay? You've seemed a little quiet lately." Clara wanted to confide in her, but couldn't find the words. She forced a smile and nodded. "I'm just tired from school," she said, her voice barely audible. Luciana's intuition told her there was more to the story, but without proof, she didn't press further. The first signs were subtle at first, almost imperceptible. A feeling of exhaustion that seemed to linger long after a good night's rest. a tightening in her abdomen that she brushed off as cramps from stress. Clara didn't want to believe it, didn't want to acknowledge what was happening to her body. She was scared, terrified even, and the silence that had kept her safe up until then, now threatened to swallow her completely. It started with nausea. Every morning for weeks, Clara would wake up with a dull ache in her stomach, a wave of dizziness threatening to pull her back into bed. She tried to chalk it up to the stress of living under Mariano's constant, watchful eye, his presence so overbearing, so full of expectation. But as the days wore on, the symptoms didn't fade, they grew stronger. One morning, as Clara stood in front of the bathroom mirror, she noticed something that made her heart race. Her breasts were tender, swollen. She rubbed a hand across her stomach, feeling a strange heaviness in the pit of her abdomen. It felt wrong, alien. Panic gripped her heart as the possibility began to form. Could it be? Could she be pregnant? The thought felt absurd, impossible. After all, it had only been that one time. She tried to push the thought out of her mind, but the fear remained, gnawing at her from the inside. Clara's body was changing. Her clothes began to feel tight around the waist, and she felt increasingly self-conscious. The nausea came in waves, and she could no longer hide the fact that something was wrong. She could barely eat. The sight of food made her stomach turn. She spent her days lying in bed, curled up in misery, wishing that somehow she could make it all go away. It wasn't until the day Clara could no longer ignore the signs that Luciana finally noticed something was terribly wrong. Luciana found her niece lying in bed, pale and sweating, clutching her stomach in agony. It was a familiar look. Luciana had seen the same signs when she had been pregnant with the girls. She immediately grew concerned and asked Clara what was going on. At first, Clara lied, saying she was just sick, that it was probably a bug, but Luciana wasn't convinced. "You've been acting strange for weeks, Clara," Luciana said, her voice soft but insistent. "You need to tell me what's really going on." Clara's heart pounded as she realized there was no escaping the truth. The tears that had been threatening to spill for so long finally began to fall. She buried her face in her hands, the weight of the truth finally too much to bear. I think I'm pregnant," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. Luciana's face went pale as the words registered, but she said nothing at first. She just sat down next to Clara, pulling her into a tight embrace. For a moment, there was only the sound of Clara's sobs filling the room. Luciana stroked her hair, her heart breaking for her niece. But then the questions began. "Who did this to you, Clara? Who?" Luciana's voice cracked, but she steadied herself. "Who is the father?" Clara couldn't say his name. She couldn't bring herself to even whisper Mariano's name. Instead, she turned her face into Luciana's shoulder and shook her head, as though doing so would somehow erase the horrible reality. Luciana held her tighter, but a part of her, deep inside, knew. She knew that the man who had once been a trusted brother, a kind father, could be capable of such an atrocity. The pieces began to fit together. The way Mariano had been acting around Clara, the way she had withdrawn into herself, the way she avoided being alone with him. Luciana didn't want to believe it, but she couldn't deny the terrible possibility. In the days that followed, Luciana took Clara to see a doctor. The pregnancy was confirmed, and the doctor expressed concern over Clara's age. At just 14, her body was not ready for this kind of strain. The doctor's warnings went in one ear and out the other, as Clara heard nothing but the pounding of her own heart in her chest. Mariano denied the allegations when he was approached, accusing Clara of lying. Luciana, fearing the stigma, chose silence. Clara was kept away from public events, her pregnancy hidden under loose clothing. The family whispered rumors to their neighbors that Clara had been seduced by a boy from her school. As Clara's due date approached, her health deteriorated. Doctors warned of the risks due to her young age, but Mariano refused to let her deliver in a public hospital, fearing exposure. Clara's labor began one stormy night, and the family rushed her to a small clinic miles away. The labor was long and grueling. Clara, frail and terrified, suffered severe complications. During an emergency cesarean section, she went into cardiac arrest and passed away. Her baby, a fragile boy, survived but was placed on a ventilator. Medical staff alerted authorities upon learning Clara's age and circumstances. Mariano was arrested at his workshop, his protests drowned out by the anger of the community. Luciana, overwhelmed with guilt, cooperated with investigators, revealing Mariano's predatory behavior. The trial exposed not only Mariano's crimes but also the societal failures that enabled them. Witnesses testified about Clara's struggles and the lack of intervention from adults who should have protected her. Mariano was sentenced to life imprisonment, but the damage had already been done. Clara's son, named Mateo by hospital staff, remained in intensive care for weeks. Rosa, heartbroken, decided to take him in, vowing to give him a better life than Clara had. The family struggled to cope with their grief and shame. The case sparked outrage and debates about Paraguay's abortion laws and the lack of sex education. Activists called for reforms, while conservative groups defended the status quo. Clara's story became a symbol of the many voiceless victims in similar circumstances. Clara's death was not in vain. Her story prompted international attention, leading to the establishment of support networks for young abuse survivors in Paraguay. While the scars remain, her name has become a rallying cry for justice and change. This tragedy reminds us that silence protects predators, and systemic failures cost lives. Clara's story underscores the urgent need for reforms to ensure no child endures such a fate again.
Loved what you saw? Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to join our growing community. Your support keeps us creating.